Persona, one of the biggest JRPG franchises out there. If you've interacted with any gaming or anime series on the internet, you've definitely bumped into this series in some way. Persona 5, the latest mainline entry, sold over 9 million copies. The protagonist of that game, Joker, was given a place in Super Smash Bros., one of the most renowned video game crossovers ever. To say Persona is big is a bit of an understatement. Its popularity has ended up dwarfing its parent series, Shin Megami Tensei, and its fanbase is large and spreads over a multitude of games. Persona 3 and 4, while not as explosively popular as 5, also have a large player base, giving rise to many spin-off titles based off these games, such as Persona 4 Arena, a fighting game which acts as a sequel to 4, and the Persona Q series, which acts as a crossover between Persona 3, 4, and 5. The Persona series is extremely well loved, both by fans and its publisher Atlus, who very clearly see it as one of the main pillars of their company. And yet, despite this love, what always fascinated me about the franchise was the lack of attention towards anything before Persona 3. So what happened to Persona 1 and 2? Within the pop culture lexicon of Persona, even very casual fans of the series could probably tell the basic gist of Persona 3, 4, and 5, even if they haven't even played them. If shown images of the characters from these games, they could probably tell you something about their personality or story. Ask them about Persona 1 and 2, you probably won't get as much. At most, maybe a vague detail about some small section of the game. For a majority of people's knowledge of the classic Persona series, it's often relegated to knowing that Hitler was an antagonist in Persona 2 because they saw a meme about it on YouTube once. A lot of fans probably don't know that Persona 2 is actually two different games, and Persona 1, even less people know of. And it's hard to blame anyone for not knowing anything, because Atlus hasn't done anything to bring these games into the current age. The most recent way to officially play these games were the PSP remasters. I don't think I've seen a PSP in my life. This thing is ancient, made back in 2005. And it's also a lack of inclusion in any modern projects. These games have no spin-offs. There's not really any inclusion in the crossovers. Atlus hasn't really given a way to interact with any of these games. Even when we recently received ports of Persona 3, 4, and 5 onto modern consoles recently, Personas 1 and 2 were left out. The only realistic way to experience these games now is through emulation. It's sad to see, but also interesting. The Persona series couldn't have existed in the way it has without these games, and yet they've been forgotten. And because of that, the perception of the classic Persona series is a bit muddled. You only really hear bits and pieces of people passing down information through a long game of telephone, to the point where a lot of understanding of these games is parroted by people who haven't even touched them. This motivated me to play these games myself, to see what's really there and form my own opinion. And what I found were games that, while different from the modern Persona games, deserve to have appreciation. While old, they weren't games that weren't Persona enough. No, they were still uniquely Persona. And they had stories and characters that didn't deserve to be forgotten. This was my dive into Persona 1, a game that laid the foundations for the entire series. I decided to play through the PSP remaster of Persona 1. It was the most recent version available, easy to emulate, has updated visuals for the UI and updated cutscenes, and most importantly has the most faithful English localization in comparison to the PS1 release. The PS1 version is pretty notorious for being a translation that tried to scrub everything Japanese out of the game in order to appeal to an American audience, something that was just commonplace at the time. I will say there are some limitations to the PSP remaster. To some in the niche group of Persona 1 fans, they feel the soundtrack is a downgrade from the original, with there being a less diverse sound to the OST, which is more in line with the J-pop of the modern games. I agree with this opinion to an extent. I think a lot of the tracks in the PS1 version better fit the mood in particular areas in the game. However, I still think the PSP OST is really good. For example, let's look at the main battle theme in the PSP version, A Lone Prayer. Its opening sets an ambiance similar to the OST of the PS1 version. Something mysterious, a bit eerie. And then, we hear a transition. A single voice singing over this ambiance. It's light, laying just on top of the instrumentals, using a very familiar J-pop sound from the modern games. Both classic and modern musical choices have met here and created a symphony. And as we go on, the song builds. transitioning us fully into the J-pop sound that many modern Persona fans are familiar with. I think this track is fantastic and is probably my favorite battle theme in the entire series. It genuinely feels like a celebration of both old and new, something I wish Atlas continued with. The story of Persona 1 was what I was most interested in. I had seen clips of gameplay before, but I couldn't tell you who any of the characters were or what the plot was. Like every Persona game that would come after, the themes and story of Persona 1 are deeply ingrained with the ideas of Jungian psychology. The idea of us having a face, a persona, that we show to others which is different from the authentic self underneath. This is highlighted immediately as the game opens with a quote from the Chinese philosopher Zhuangzi. Yet, there's a distinction between myself and the butterfly. This is a transformation of the physical. The opening of Persona 1 is one I was pretty impressed with because of how fast it introduces us to all the characters in a way that doesn't feel rushed. We start out in a classroom in St. Hermilien High School, where a small group of students have gathered. Brown, one of the students, tells everyone of a rumor called the Persona game, something akin to the Bloody Mary game where you say her name 3 times in the bathroom mirror. Another student, Mark, thinks this is stupid, which encourages Brown to further insist on them trying the Persona game to see what'll happen. From this opening, we instantly get a pretty good sense of all the characters' personalities. While the game does provide character bios to them when they say their first lines, we don't really need them. Off the bat, we can see Brown as a jokester who is desperate to get attention, trying to get his peers to follow him into superstitions. Mark is a class clown, knocking down on Brown, not really taking anything seriously. From Brown and Mark's little conflict, a bet is started to see who's correct, an attempt by Brown to convince everyone to participate. When we see who the other characters bet on, it also gives an insight into them. Nanjo is an uptight rich kid who is somewhat of an egotist, emphasized by the big number 1 he wears in his school uniform. He obviously doesn't believe in the supernatural, so he doesn't really care and he sits out on the bet. Yukino is also a pretty serious person, though she doesn't have the ego that Nanjo has, and she also sits out on the bet. Ellie and Ayase decide to bet on Brown, Ellie being somewhat of a weird girl, and Ayase clearly betting on him because she's looking to have some fun. Even you have a choice on who you want to bet on. Once the bets are made, the Persona game ritual starts. But at the end of it, nothing happens, prompting Mark to celebrate and Brown to argue that they should try again. But as they argue, Nanjo notices a mysterious little girl who's appeared in the room with them. Before they can register what happened, you and your friends are struck by lightning, transporting you into a dream. Here you meet Philemon, a mysterious figure who asks for your name. Seeing that you have the strength to know your identity, he provides you the power of Persona, the ability to bring out demons who represent the many personalities within yourself. Waking up in the school infirmary, you realize that everyone else had that strange dream. Miss Sayako, one of your teachers, suggests that you go to the town's hospital to get yourself checked out, and maybe while you're there, you can visit your friend that's been there for a while, Maki. But before visiting the hospital, the game gives you a lot of freedom to explore the school and town. You can visit the Sepik building and encounter Kendori, the main antagonist of the Sepik route, before the main conflict even begins. Going to the factory, you can find Reiji earlier in the game, the last optional party member you're able to choose. With how much you're able to explore before the main events of the game even begin, it's clear the developers wanted this game to be something you would play again and again to learn more about the world. This is made even more evidently clear when you learn that there are 2 possible story routes you can embark on, and you also have a choice on who your 5th party member is. Returning back to the plot, when you go to the hospital, you find Maki there. She's bedridden, having suffered from an unknown illness for the majority of the school year. While she seems to be doing fine, she suddenly begins to look worse, and she has to be sent to the ICU. As our protagonists wait outside to see if she'll be alright, the world begins to rumble, and to their shock, the doors to the ICU seem to lead to nowhere. All of a sudden, the town is filled with demons. As they run to the hordes of monsters, they find that they can summon personas that were shown to them by Philemon, allowing them to get to the hospital safely. Learning that Maki's mother is at the town shrine, they all head there to try and find out what's happening. When they get there, they receive another vision from Philemon, telling them they have multiple paths they can choose. Maki's mother is in the shrine as well, and injured. She tells us that Kendori, a fellow employee at Sepik, is behind everything that has happened so far, utilizing Sepik's Deva system in order to alter reality. We take her back to the school because that is currently the only safe location in town. And now, we have a choice to pick between the 2 story paths in Persona 1. The main path, the Sepik route, is going after Kendori and stopping him from using the Deva system further, where you travel with Nanjo, Mark, and a mysteriously healthy Maki, who has appeared at the school, acting as if she's always been there, alongside an optional party member. The other path you can choose is the Snow Queen route, where you, Yukino, Ayase, and 2 other optional characters go to uncover the mystery of a possessed Miss Sayako, and a mask which is somehow related to a string of suicides within the town. I'll mostly be discussing the Sebek route here because it's the main story path, and I'm more well versed in it, but I'll definitely be making some comparisons to the two routes. In the Sebek route, I really appreciate the constant presence of Kandori and Aki, a little girl who bears a suspicious resemblance to Maki, as antagonists within the story. Having antagonists who are present from beginning to end lets their relationship with the protagonist and their own character feel fleshed out. Unfortunately, while I like them, I do feel the story doesn't really fully utilize their characters, which is a shame, because there's a lot of cool things that are happening here. Kandori is interesting because of the ardent inherent relationship he has with Nanjo and Reiji. Nanjo knowing him because their families' businesses intersect, and Reiji being his half-brother, who blames him for the way his life has turned out. He's a man on a quest for godhood and willing to achieve it by any means. I wish the game gave more time to flesh out his relationship and opposing ideals of Nanjo and Reiji, alongside the familial relationship he has with Aki. For his motivation to do what he does, while I think it's pretty great into fitting into the themes of the game, I do wish it was revealed early in the story so it could have been more fleshed out. Aki is also an extremely interesting character who I feel wasn't fully realized. As we delve deeper into the story, we learn that she's the destructive id of Maki given form, after Maki mysteriously linked to the Deva system. She harbors deep affection for Kandori, going so far to refer to him as father, despite them not being related in any way. This relationship between the two antagonists is genuinely really interesting, and I was fully expecting a deeper exploration into it, but in the end, we only get to see the surface of it. And unfortunately, almost none of the minor bosses in the Sebek route have any depth or importance to the story. As you and your party try to stop Kandori, exploring a mysterious alternate world which is almost the same as yours but only slightly different, you encounter enemies set up by Kandori and Aki to slow you down. These enemies are basically all just demons with no real character, simply acting as obstacles. Though there is one exception. One antagonist you'll fight is Chisato, a fellow classmate who was seemingly friends with Maki. However, it's revealed that she was actually jealous of Maki's artistic talent, feeling as if she could never escape her shadow. She purposely attempted to hurt Maki because of this, one example being when she dated a boy named Yosuke that she knew Maki had a crush on. Aki was able to use his jealousy to manipulate Chisato to fight you and Maki in the alternate world. In the end, her arc is resolved with Yosuke coming to her, and her admitting that despite her initial reasons for dating him, she did learn to love him for who he was, leading her to accept herself more and ends up apologizing to the group. Her arc isn't perfect, and definitely could have used more time to develop, but in the end, I do appreciate the attempt to make at least one of the minor antagonists in the game to have some sort of depth. Interestingly, the Snow Queen route does have minor antagonists who are more ingrained in the story and have more depth. Before the final boss, you tackle 3 sub-bosses, each one being a victim to the mask that now possesses Miss Sayako. For the most part, they're well-written characters who, when we defeat them, we help them pass on. The main antagonist, the Snow Queen, was actually a friend of Miss Sayako's, who took her place as the lead in the Snow Queen play, which ended up in her face being disfigured, giving her a strong reason to do what she does throughout the game. Though, for all its weaknesses, I feel the Sebek's overarching story is a bit more interesting, because of its deeper connection to the main themes of Jungian psychology and how it shows those ideas through Lovecraftian concepts, creating something that is unique and fun. As the party goes to the alternate world, they finally corner Kandori, who has lost all his ambitions for godhood, and they watch him become possessed by his own persona, Nyarlathotep. After his defeat, they learn the truth of Maki, her relation to the Deva system, and the alternate world, leading them on a final quest to save Maki from falling on the same path of isolation as Kandori. In the end, the town is saved, and Maki has been cured of her illness, and our group of high schoolers who were brought together through inexplicable events have grown closer, now having learned to accept the different identities within themselves. It's a story that feels intimate, being much more character-focused than a lot of previous SMT titles, and manages to utilize the ideas of personas and themes to analyze the human condition of our high school characters, and in particular, the character of Maki. For the Sebek route of the game, the story is one that is about Maki, using her as a vehicle to further explore the ideas of different faces that we show to others around us. Exploring the other world, we learn that the healthy Maki that's been traveling with us is actually not the Maki we knew in the hospital. She originates from the world we are currently exploring. Near the end of the game, we learn that the original Maki's mind is linked to the Deva system after Kandori's experiments, creating an alternate version of the town based on her ideal version of it. This led to her psyche being split into 3 versions. The ideal Maki, someone who's never been sick and loved by everyone. Mai, the little girl in white which the group saw after the Persona game, who represents Maki's innocence. And Aki, the little girl in black, who represents Maki's malevolence. The relation between the ideal Maki and the original is one of Persona's strongest story elements. In the early game, from meeting Maki in the hospital to her injured mother, we know the relationship is strained, and from how we see her ideal self, She is someone who wants to be loved, who hates being left behind because of an illness. And with these experiences, from being left out from everything while being in the hospital, it's clear that negative emotions spawn from it, being represented by Aki. These negative emotions come full swing as the final antagonist of the game, Pandora, another version of Maki representing her nihilism in the world, who devoured Aki after Kandori's defeat, desiring to create a world of nothingness. In the end, the group and the ideal Maki convince Pandora to merge back with Maki, telling her that living in isolation is no way to live. And as the group leave for the real world, the ideal Maki tells us she can't leave with us because she's just a shadow of Maki's true self, only one aspect of it. She confesses her love for the protagonist, and she asks us to try and remember her from time to time. It's a personal and sweet story. A story of a girl and her friends, learning how to get to the hardships of life and to accept themselves in all their different personas. That last goodbye from the ideal Maki is heartwarming and bittersweet, saying goodbye to someone who we'll never see again. I love how the story is deeply focused on Maki and how it utilizes her and our different selves. Persona is a series which has utilized the idea of characters tackling other aspects of themselves head-on, usually in the form of shadows. Shadows in Persona 2 were used in a way to show how much the characters had grown from the start of the game, while in the modern games, they are used as instigators for the character's growth. While Persona 1 uses the idea of tackling other selves head-on in the traditional sense with the protagonist in his shadow, I found how they use Maki to be unique and loaded with depth. It's something I'm shocked we haven't really seen again in the series, and I genuinely hope in future installments, we get to see another character like Maki. However, with the game almost solely focused on Maki, it does come with its downsides. None of the other characters really get a dedicated amount of time to any character arcs like in Personas 2 through 5. There's no sections solely dedicated to the growth of one character, although there are some small arcs, like with Nanjo and the protagonist. While it isn't really a problem with the story because it's very clear the main focus should be on Maki, I do wish we did get some dedicated moments with other characters, because they all have strong and unique personalities and fun dynamics with each other. The small moments of growth we do see made me wish we got to see more. In the Sebek route, two of your mandatory party members are Nanjo and Mark. Inherently, these two characters bounce off perfectly with each other. Nanjo is rich and pompous, constantly looking down on Mark, who is more of a delinquent. He's someone who always tries to put up a face of unmoving conviction and confidence, which pisses Mark off. But that makes it infinitely more interesting when we see that phase break. Nanjo is someone who throughout the story makes decisions based on the idea that one should fend for himself. But as the game progresses, he learns to be compassionate for others. We see this sparked when, at the beginning of the game, he watches as Butler is killed by demons. And it's really sweet to see how as the game progresses, his relationship between Mark softens, and it turns from them simply being classmates to being friends. This character growth is shown through his unlocking of his ultimate persona, who is his Butler's spirit, giving a second chance to protect his master. Unfortunately, there is another weakness to the game's portrayal of its characters other than the lack of focus on other party members. Because the last party member you could have is optional, and there being a lot of different options to choose from, it meant the developers couldn't really give this member an active role in the story or character interactions, because they didn't know which character you would have in each story beat, and while they could have had alternate versions for each character, that was probably way too much work. I felt this weakness a lot in my first playthrough. I picked Brown as my 5th member because he's the first one you can pick, and in the opening act, he bounced off pretty well with Mark. Unfortunately, you'll never really get to see Mark and Brown interact at all, because Brown ends up taking a passive role, only really saying comments in the background of the story. This really sucks because we got to see some fantastic character dynamics with Brown at the beginning of the game. Shifting over to the more positives of the character writing, I'd like to talk about the main antagonist, Kandori, specifically the final fight you have with him. The entire game, you're climbing through hell just to finally beat this guy and fix everything he's done. You've seen him obliterate your town, and now you need to beat him and somehow fix this. The expectation is to go in guns blazing. Kandori will probably talk about becoming a god and then you'll go to fight. But instead, when we corner him, he tells us he doesn't want to fight. He's done. He doesn't want to do this anymore. I was genuinely shocked here. Before this, he was basically acting as a very basic JRPG main antagonist. He wants to be God. Cool. But now, things have changed. He tells us motivation for why he did everything. We all desired to climb higher, be better, and so he did. He climbed as far as he could and became a god. But then, where do you go from there? He found his summit, and now he doesn't know what to do. He has nothing left. In fact, the only reason he even fights you is because our group taunts him, and for obvious reasons. He screwed with us the entire game, blew up our town, and is now telling us he's just done. I love this moment in the game, and I just wish we got to see an actual arc to this point. As I said earlier in the video, I feel that if the desire was done earlier in the story, the writers probably could have made an actual feeling of rising tension to this point. I wouldn't say this act feels jarring, but it definitely would have hit harder if you could feel a build up to this event. Another small note I have with this final fight with Kandori, I do like how his persona, Nyarlathotep, the Lovecraft outer god, was manipulating him and then turned him into a soulless god, an ironic end for Kandori. It's also nice how Nyarlathotep returns as the final antagonist in Persona 2. Small note, the original PS1 translation calls his god form of Kandori Super Guido, which I find insanely funny. To the few people who watch this video, let me know, Super Guido is my goat. Philemon is an interesting character because he only really shows up in Persona 1 and 2. He's a godlike figure who bestows philosophical knowledge of personas to humans in order to help their growth, and watches over the world in his butterfly form, a reference to the opening quote of the game. His design is really cool, and he's the boss of the Velvet Room, something that's been present in all Persona games. I do wish Igor would still make reference to him being his boss in the modern games, but Philemon, especially after the events of Persona 2, is a character who I doubt we'll ever see again. And honestly, I could live with that. He's not that vital to the franchise, and they do sometimes reference him by putting a butterfly on screen, so honestly he's doing better than a lot of the other characters from Persona 1 and 2. Finally, I'd like to talk about the protagonist. Like almost all other SMT protagonists, the Persona 1 protagonist is a silent one, and unlike the protagonists of Persona 2 through 5, the developers very heavily wanted this one to be a self-insert of yourself. You don't really get to know much about his character unlike the other protagonists of the series, and it does make sense why they did this. Persona is a game about learning what the different masks you wear in society and learning to accept your true self. So it makes sense they want to literally give you one and insert yourself into the game. While he doesn't have as much depth as his other peers in the series, there's still things that they did with him that I really like. As you progress through the game, you learn that the protagonist was pretty quiet. He didn't talk to a lot of people in school, and nobody really knew much about you. Some of your fellow party members will compliment you as you complete tasks, telling you they didn't know you were like this. It's pretty cool to see as the protagonist's own mask is unraveled and people see his true self. This crazy event that just happened has brought people together who normally wouldn't be. In a way, these events have brought your protagonist out of their shell, and it comes full circle when you encounter your shadow. While exploring a dungeon with Maki at the end of the game, it comes to an end when you walk into a room and find yourself playing on an arcade machine. As Maki asks if this is really you, your shadow responds rudely, telling you that he knows who you really are. As he speaks, he never looks at us, looking only at the machine. Then he takes us back, and we get to rewatch all the optional choices we were able to make throughout the game. He tells us that there are thousands of different selves within us, and we need a strong will to continue forward to truly live as ourselves. Is this moment subtle? No, but it's pretty cool and it's very clearly talking to both us and the protagonist, telling us both to continue strongly into our future. The gameplay of Persona 1 is definitely the biggest deviation between the classic games and the modern games, but it's still something that is familiar. Just like every other Persona game, it takes from the groundwork laid by SMT If and the Devil Summoner series, where the party of characters you play with are no longer a revolving door of different demons like in the mainline SMT games, but instead, a static group of characters who remain with you throughout the game. There are no social links or social sim elements in this game, all character interactions being baked directly into the story, instead of something you go out and explore more of on your own. Dungeon crawling is done through a first-person point of view, which is the status quo for all SMT games at the time. For first-time players, this can be a bit divisive. It's such a different way of exploration in comparison to every other Persona game. For me personally, I found it pretty interesting. I'd never played an RPG that had exploration into the first person before. Though if this is too off-putting for you, not to worry, because the game also has third-person perspectives for exploring rooms and battles. With battles being in the third person instead of the usual first person, like in previous SMT titles, the game tries to experiment with combat, utilizing a grid system where moves have certain ranges and areas of damage. I do appreciate this mechanic. It's clear that developers wanted to show off something that was innovative with this brand new series, but honestly, it is a bit lackluster. Because a lot of the matching abilities just cover the entire grid, most of the time you don't really need to think about it. Team formation was something I set up once and didn't really change throughout the rest of my playthrough. It's something that could have led to some very interesting gameplay strategies, but the system was retired after this game, so it never really got to reach its full potential. Another big difference between the classic series and the modern series is the contact system. Within a lot of SMT games, there's usually an ability to communicate with the enemy. In the mainline SMT titles, the demons will usually talk to you to ask a few questions, and if you answer correctly, they'll join your party. It's a really cool mechanic, and Persona 1 sought to flesh it out. Now, instead of the demon asking questions, your party members can now take the initiative, each one having 4 different contact options to start a conversation with. These can range from dancing to spewing out philosophical beliefs. Depending on your choice, the demon will respond, and in the corner, the emotion chart will change depending on the reaction. If you make a demon eager enough, it'll give you a spell card, which is how you obtain personas in this game. I think this is a really cool idea. Giving initiative to the characters lets them show off their individuality and personality. The ability to reveal more about a character through gameplay is something I'd love to see more of. unfortunately this mechanic is a bit overambitious. With each character having 4 different contact options to choose from in a party of 5, that means you have a total of 20 different contacts to utilize, all of which will affect the emotions of a demon in either 4 different ways. In other titles, it was basically just answering 1 or 2 questions, and if you answered right, you get something, and if you answered wrong, they attack you. While it's something I love because of the capability to reveal characters within battles, it's a little too overwhelming for something that you aren't going to use all the time. It's a mechanic that's been missing in Persona 3 and 4, and while Persona 5 does have Shadow Talk, it's more in line with how contact works in the mainline SMT games. New personas can be obtained by fusing 2 different spell cards together, and every character in your party is capable of having multiple personas. Spell card fusion is derived from demon fusion from previous titles, though it isn't as great. In other SMT games, you can use the demons you fuse together in battle before the fusion, but in Persona 1, because the spell cards you fuse together just act as items, they're basically useless until they can give you a persona you need. This is definitely an area where you can feel the developers trying to find a sweet spot of differentiating the game from SMT. Yes, it is different, but it just feels worse. Even so, it was an important step forward, and we can see how the idea of fusions and personas evolved to be more intuitive, with persona fusions being implemented in the modern games. There are a lot of other minor differences from this game and the modern ones, but at the end of the day, it's still a Persona game. You can see the foundation of the modern games being laid out here. Yes, they are a bit rough, but without them, what we have now wouldn't have been possible. And I wouldn't say this game is bad. Yes, I have a lot of criticism of it, but often I feel that some of the opinions in the community is that the gameplay is bad. I've seen a lot of people saying the game is aged poorly and is too clunky, but honestly, it's a pretty standard older style JRPG. If you haven't played games of that style before, it's definitely something you need to get used to, or something you might just not like at all, but I think it's disingenuous to say the gameplay is bad. Throughout my playthrough, I didn't really feel or see anything that got in the way of my experience. Through all my critiques, it's still something you can have fun with even now if you enjoy the style of game. Obviously, it's not for everyone. If you aren't a fan of older style JRPGs with random encounters and such, this isn't the game for you. To anyone looking to try out the older games, it's something I'd say to go into with the proper frame of reference. But genuinely, I'd say to give it a chance. I'll fully admit, I used to not care for RPGs, especially older ones. I was one of those people who thought turn-based combat was boring and didn't really care for random encounters. I remember I tried playing the original Final Fantasy VII and just couldn't get into it. Then I tried the Octopath Traveler demo, got lost in an area where I was 200 leveled and I gave up on that too. I just thought, that just isn't for me. Then I decided I'd try the original Final Fantasy VII again, telling myself I'd get at least halfway. And I'm so thankful I did. Not only did I get further than halfway, I finished it. I genuinely loved all the time I'd put into it, and because of that, I was willing to go out and try more of these older RPGs I kept on hearing about. It opened up a whole new world for me. And so with that, again, I say give it a genuine chance. Maybe you'll hate it. Maybe you'll like it. And maybe it'll be a gateway to some fantastic games. With my initial question of what even happens in the classic Persona games, I ended up finding something that was pretty special. Is Persona 1 the best game I've ever played? No, not at all. But it's a game with a lot of heart. And I think the fact that it's gone under the radar, even though it's connected to such a big series, has really endeared me to it. It's a game I hope Atlus does eventually come back to. With Persona 3 Reload coming out soon, it's clear that they're willing to go back to older games, and I'd be really interested to see how they'd handle a Persona 1 remake. It's a game with a lot of unrealized potential. I think if it was built from the ground up, we could see something genuinely amazing. I do hope Atlus doesn't continue to ignore Persona 1 and 2. I think they're fantastic games. Really, I'm praying this video could end up on that poorly aged thing's Twitter account. At the very least, I'd hope we can get some ports of these games. They know these games exist. They did the bare minimum of at least acknowledging them in the Persona anniversary. So hopefully maybe in the future, we'd see something more than just new artwork. But while Atlus has seemingly forgotten about the classic games, there are still fans out there. While not as bountiful as the modern fanbase, it's really cool to see people be passionate about them, and it's nice to see that they aren't completely forgotten. Persona 1 is a game that laid the philosophical and thematic foundation for the franchise. Its gameplay, while now starkly different from the modern games, was an important step forward. If you're willing, it's a game that's worth giving a shot. It's a heartfelt story with a small but dedicated fanbase. And while forgotten by Atlus, it's not forgotten by us.